Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, October 14th, 2025, and our dear friend John Helmer joins us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me back, Nima.
John, let's start with Donald Trump's one of the latest comments of Donald Trump considering the Tomahawk missiles being sent to Ukraine if Russia continues with this sort of behavior that they don't want to talk and negotiate with Ukrainians. If the situation goes in that direction, he's going to send the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. And on the other hand, we had Zelensky suggesting that there are there are various ways to send these Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. One of them is NATO's PURL program, which other countries within NATO can buy them from the United States and then send them to Ukraine. What's your take? What's your understanding of the the latest moves towards sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine?
Let me start with something I think fundamental that we need to understand about the Russian approach. In fact, everyone's approach to President Trump. Trump is not, and we've said this before, Trump is not the decision maker. He's a retro actor. He is endorsing by jingle, by slogan, by repetition, by dramatization, what's already been decided. He's not the ventriloquist here. He's the doll. And what comes out of his mouth depends on whose hands are in his back, or in the Trump family's case, whose hands are in his pockets. So when we talk about what Trump says, we have to understand the forces pressing in at the White House, in the Washington administration, between the administration and Kiev, and between the administration and the major European powers, particularly France, the UK, Germany, and to a lesser extent, Italy and the others. What Trump was saying is that he thinks, because there is a view in Washington and in Europe, that if the Ukrainians can be made to appear to be winning the war, but if they can be made to appear to be damaging the Russian economy in a serious way, and Trump has said it because there are all sorts of European and American claims, and the mass media that reflect those claims endorse them. Rising petrol prices, queues in front of Russian gas stations, and so on. The Russian economy's crumbling. The Russian economy and the Russian army amount to paper tigers. This is the phrase that Trump has used. He's saying what he's told to say because it suits him. The key aspect of his character that he adds to the Tomahawk issue is he thinks he can intimidate an adversary or an opponent. So what he said was on the aircraft heading towards Palestine, in the first place, he's threatening. He's good at that. He's had a whole lifetime imitating his father. He threatens. He intimidates. And he says, if I really think I'm reading from my text. I really think President Putin would look great if he got this settled, and I think he's gonna settle it. But we're gonna see. If he doesn't, it's not going to be good for him. Not going to be good. Then he goes on to talk about the Zelensky proposal for Tomahawks, which would be paid through NATO, as you just said. Then he says his belief is that he can intimidate Russia, threaten Putin, the paper tiger, the disintegrating economy, by showing that the Tomahawk is an effective weapon that is deterrent for Russian plans. And so he says, I think I might, I'm quoting, I think I might speak to Russia about that, in all fairness. I told that to President Zelensky because tomahawks are a new step of aggression, right? And then he was asked, you mean you'll talk to Putin about the tomahawks? Trump. And I might talk to him. I might say, look, if this war's not going to get settled, I'm going to send them tomahawks. I may say that. Tomahawk is an incredible weapon, very offensive weapon, and honestly, Russia does not need that. They don't need that. Now, that's being interpreted in two ways among my sources in Moscow. In the first place, there's a line of thinking in Moscow that, in fact, Trump is egging on the Russians to finish the war in Ukraine faster, which is why you've headlined this broadcast, the Oreshnik moment. The notion that Russia could, if all stops were pulled out and all weapons deployed, finish the war quickly. So there is a line in Washington that interprets what Trump says to mean an encouragement to finish it quickly before he has to make more decisions.
Yeah, you mean there is a line in Moscow?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't happen to think it's true, and I don't see that it's the consensus of policy making in Moscow. And as we've said before, President Putin runs a consensus policy making system for the war and for the diplomacy with Trump. But there is no readiness to criticize Trump on the basis I've just said. Nobody will call him the ventriloquist doll. Nobody will refer to his cognitive incapacities. Nobody will refer to his weaknesses. No one will criticize him. In fact, as you've seen over the past few days, President Putin has gone to some lengths to endorse him for the Nobel Prize after the event, without criticizing that the Nobel Peace Prize went to someone whose aim is to destroy the Venezuelan regime, with which Putin has a strategic partnership treaty, for God's sake. So the Tomahawk issue means different things to each side. Let's just take the three sides. On Trump's side, it symbolizes his sense of potency. Never mind that the Tomahawks he ordered fired against Syria had a success rate of something less than 70%. He thinks it's an intimidating weapon because intimidation is how he negotiates, if you want to call that negotiation. For Zelensky and for the Europeans, the threat of the Tomahawk deployment is an indication, that the war can continue. The war can be won by the Ukrainians. And Zelensky understands he needs to have that message over and over again. So it suits him almost as much if Trump says, I'm thinking about it, as if Trump says, I've been decided. Because if it's been decided that missiles will be fired and Russia will not only shoot most of them down, but will retaliate. That's a bigger problem for the US. Zelensky needs to keep the process going because it keeps him in power. It keeps him richer. Second, Zelensky, in pursuit of this and the other agenda items, the Patriot missile, the funding and so forth, Zelensky needs to be seen in the world as constantly talking to Trump. This is an endorsement of Zelensky against all domestic opposition, including presidential candidates like Zelensky sitting in London. So Zelensky's going to go to Washington to see Trump to discuss tomahawks, which they say they can't talk on the telephone. You mean they can't talk on the telephone? Of course they can. What they're going to do is for Zelensky a photo opportunity to show that he is fully embraced by Trump and the administration to continue the war. So that's Zelensky's interpret, that's the use that Zelensky makes of the Tomahawk issue. The Russian side is a combination of arguments. In the first place, there was an argument over whether President Putin had played down the Russian reaction if the Tomahawk is fired. That was then corrected since Putin's appearance in Valdai. He had his spokesman point out that the Tomahawk is nuclear capable. So if it's fired, the Russian side has to understand it may carry a nuclear warhead, which would be the case, possibly, as has been explained by President Putin many times for the last 10 years, if the Tomahawk is fired from the Polish Aegis battery or the Romanian one. So the deployment of the Tomahawk threatens a retaliation. It threatens potential tactical nuclear retaliation by the Russian side, or it threatens the next best thing or the better thing, and that's the Oreshnik. So then there's a discussion in the Russian side that we don't need the Oreshnik. We are proceeding slowly at a pace and with methods that minimize our casualties to destroy the Ukrainian army. The Oreshnik can destroy its target, thoroughly obliterated. But if it destroyed some chunk of the decision-making capacity in Kiev, it's unlikely to catch Zelensky, Yermak, Budanov, and the others. Why? Because they don't live, work, or sit in Kiev any longer. Zelensky himself may hardly be in Kiev except when he's meeting people like Kaja Kallas, the Estonian who currently is the foreign minister of the European Union. He shows up for ceremonial reasons. He is elsewhere. So the Oreshnik, as a retaliatory option from a Russian point of view, has destructive power, yes, but limitations for ending the war quickly. But so that's the way in which the Russian side is dealing with the so-called Tomahawk threat. No criticism of Trump, always suggesting that the Trump understandings are continuing. And that's an argument too in Moscow.
John, after all, the plan on the part of the United States and Donald Trump himself, in my opinion, is to pressure Russia, and the leverage they want to create for themselves is through, somehow avoiding Russia from sending their oil and gas. And it's all about, I don't know if you saw the article in Financial Times. They're talking about how the United States is providing Ukraine with the targets inside Russia, deep inside
Yes.
Russia, to hit the refineries, pipelines inside Russia,
Yes.
in order to make some sort of distraction, some sort of problem internally for Russia to export the oil and gas. And we had Scott Bessent 2 days ago, again and again, over and over, repeating that China and India should stop buying Russian oil. They can buy it from the United States. The ultimate goal is you go with the soft power on Russia, on China and India, maybe Turkey comes to the game. Or on the other hand, you somehow provide Ukraine with the intelligence, with the targets through Europeans or directly to Ukrainians to hit the targets deep in Russian soil in order to make some sort of problem internally for Russia.
Yes.
How is that going to be perceived by the Putin administration and the people in Moscow? Because the evidence is out there. What would be the reaction to that?
Well, the reaction takes several different forms. In the first place, as I've just said, the at the level of the Kremlin, that's President Putin, his spokesman Dmitry Peskov, his foreign policy advisor Yuri Ushakov, and his emissary for promoting business bribery and other inducements to the Trump administration to come to terms on sanctions and war settlement terms. There will be no criticism of Trump. In fact, they will go on flattering Trump with the purpose of what they say is continuing the understandings in Alaska. On the other hand, President Putin has delegated to the general staff the job of finishing the war at the lowest human cost to the Russian side. So this is a massive escalation of electric war campaign, attacks on the electric infrastructure of trains, lighting, sewerage, and all the functions of the cities, bakeries, sewerage processing, and so forth, and the railways. In this context, the other side is coming up with the continuation of the war against the Russian economy. And as you said, it takes several forms. First, you mentioned the secondary sanctions threat, the pressure on China and India, the principal buyers of Russian oil, gas, and coal too.
It's more than 80%. It's more than
Correct.
80%, yeah.
Yes. So that as Europe cut off its trade with Russian energy, the Russian energy has been reoriented to India and China principally. So the theory of war fighting against Russia is destroy the oil and gas trade, and you destroy the Russian capacity to fight. And you will bring them to capitulation as quickly as possible. So one instrument is secondary sanctions. One instrument is direct attacks on the tanker fleet. And we've seen two examples of that in the last 2 weeks. The French boarding of the Borosay tanker off Saint-Nazaire, which a Borosay tanker was a Benin flag tanker. It had changed its name, it had changed its flag. It's described in the Financial Times and the Bloomberg and the anti-Russian press as part of the Black Fleet. In other words, the sanctions busting fleet. From a Western point, from an Allied point of view, boarded. The master and the second in command Chinese nationals were taken off. The master's been charged with 2 offenses. One is not failing to follow French military orders, and second, failing to explain the change of registration. In other words, trumped up charges designed to slow the vessel down and stop it without seizing its cargo. The same stunt was used by the Danes in the Danish Straits, with the long-term threat of closing the Danish Straits, not by attacking Russian cargoes, but by detaining them for trumped-up reasons, slowing down the process, raising insurance premiums, raising the uncertainty of any buyer of Russian oil, that it can be delivered in a predictable period of time. This is a direct attack on the trade, which threatens to close the Danish Straits, the exit from the Baltic Sea into the Atlantic. And that's a very serious threat to Russian trade logistics. The third method is to attack physically, planting mines and attacking tankers, and that too has happened. So there are direct military, there's pseudo-military, and then there's the secondary sanctions, the economic pressures, all of which are part of the package of economic war, Why are we at this stage? Because all of the direct sanctions on Russia since 2014, the Obama administration began it, have failed. They've failed to deter Russian military success. They've failed to make a significant impact on the Russian economy, and they've done nothing whatsoever to damage President Putin's stable, extremely high, 87% public approval rate. And the sanctions on Russia have had the positive effect of reversing almost half a generation since 1996 of capital disinvestment by the oligarchs of 1996, who've continued in power under the Putin administration. So the failure of economic warfare against Russia has led to this stage now. Does that explain what you were asking me to explain?
Yeah. John, looking at Europe today, if let's assume they manage the way that Donald Trump somehow decides to continue the conflict in Ukraine,
Yes.
what is in the mind of Europeans? Do they want to let Ukraine on the front line and just kill more Ukrainians, or they're planning to do something, to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, or escalating the situation with Russia in terms of maybe directly involving, being involved in some sort of conflict? I'm not talking about attacking
Mm.
Russia, but putting more mercenaries, sending more, this military officials to Ukraine to help them. What is in the mind of Europeans as we talk?
It's another good question. Remember, we started with one fundamental. Trump is not the decision maker. So now let's go to the second fundamental. Each of the European states has its own good political reason for war with Russia. So we have to look at each of the European states to understand the answer to your question. Overall, we could say, unlike some of my US blog and podcast colleagues, the Europeans are not brain dead. Their coalition is not the coalition of the brain dead. They are not stupid. Yes, they've encouraged a doctrine of racism. Yes, they've created an information war that produces fictions like Novichok as a Russian weapon invading the UK and then invading Germany and so on. But each country, each of these major powers, has its own good reason for continuing the war. In the case of France, the French Constitution allows, under Article 16, paragraph 6, that if the state has its interests under threat, not simply a direct warfare threat, its interests are threatened. I can read the Constitution. I've got it to the right of me, but let's skip the details. Under the French Constitution, the president can rule by executive diktat. And President Macron, facing the last years of his second term, he ends in 2027, is extremely unpopular, but he's effectively ruling without parliament, without actually invoking Section 16 of the Constitution. But war with Russia and the economic warfare that we just described, and the threat that the Russians will fly drones out of the Ukraine into Denmark, Poland, and possibly France, and so on and so on. All of this stuff is part and parcel of Macron's attempt to rule alone, defy Parliament, which itself is so divided it can vote to no confidence in the prime minister, and Macron can send back the same man to be prime minister again, Sébastien Lecornu. Why? because Macron is now ruling alone, dictatorially, and the war is essential to that form of rule under the French Constitution. What about in Germany? In Germany, you've got, and I'm just reaching to read you the unpopularity of these states making war with Russia. Trump has a negative approval rate of -11. He's much more popular, or should we say much less unpopular with American voters than the Europeans who want to continue the war. Meloni is -22, Meloni of Italy. Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, is -30 percentage points. Keir Starmer is -47. You're getting to the bottom of the barrel. And finally, Macron is -55. Now, when you've got leaders of weak political regimes, in each case, you've got fear of a more powerful regime knocking you out. In Germany, as we were beginning to say, Merz is frightened of the Alliance for Germany, AfD. He's both repressing it, attacking its members by police methods, and a relentless propaganda that it's soft on Russia, it's weak on Germany. Why? Because Merz is very vulnerable to the AfD's domestic policies, principally its policies on immigration, which are, and immigration is the dominant cultural, political, economic issue in each of these countries, taking different forms. In the UK, it's not different. Starmer, as we've just seen, is about as unpopular as a as a prime minister can be, certainly as unpopular as the Tory prime ministers who preceded him. What's he afraid of? Answer, you look at the polls. In the current English political lineup, the Reform Party of Nigel Farage has a 35% polling support compared to Labour, the ruling party, which has 22%, and the Tories somewhere around 12. So what you've got in Starmer's mind is the necessity at his level of unpopularity to preserve the party in power against its principal enemy, which is Farage's reform. And in several different ways in English politics, fighting the Russians, continuing the war, keeps Starmer in power. So back to the fundamental, we won't bother with the others. We could. Prime Minister Meloni, Alexander Stubb in Finland, Donald Tusk in Poland. It's the same in general, very unpopular leader who believes that he can stay in power, feed his constituents with money, feed himself, his family, and his friends with money, and continue the information war against Russia. Now, we come back to your point. It would fail their purposes if they actually engaged in war with boots on the ground in the Ukraine. No, they won't do that. Why? It would defeat the purpose that I just outlined, right? So they've got to continue the war, militarize along the northern front, the Arctic front, and so forth, because that's part of Trump's 5% GDP on defense demand. They must do what Trump wants, because in order to save themselves tariff punishment and preserve their trade positions, which in turn preserves their constituencies. All of these things mixed produces a consensus that continuing the war is good for them. That's not stupid. It's not dumb. It's cynical, vicious, racist, and so forth and so on. We can use any number of adjectives, but it's essential all of us listening and all of us thinking about this understands that the Europeans have good reason in their minds for continuing, but they don't have a reason for actually fighting. That produces body bags. Body bags plus inflation kills governments stone dead quickly. They must avoid that. So that in order to continue the war, they found the financial solution. Trump's found his solution. You, Europe, pay me to supply you with Patriot systems, Tomahawks perhaps, and all the rest. And you give it to the Ukraine. But where's the money coming from? Well, these very weak regimes can't tax their own people more than they presently are. They can't destroy their hospital and educational systems and so forth any more than they have. They must come up with a new source of multi-billion-dollar or euro war fighting. What have they come up with? Seize the Russian assets. So Russia will pay them to continue the war, to keep in power. By the way, this means, if you all accept this argument, that the Russian tactic or the Russian strategy of castigating the Europeans and trying to split the Europeans from Trump will fail. It must fail. And for the same reason, the Russians' notion that President Trump's the opportunity to end the war and can force the Europeans to follow suit, that's also going to fail for all the political reasons I've just explained. So the Russian strategy, political strategy towards Trump versus Europe is based on a mistake, a big one.
John, what do you make of what the NATO Secretary General said about China will force Russia to attack NATO? What is this? It's so bizarre. It's unbelievably bizarre, these sort of comments. Here is what he said, John.
Likely that China will force the junior partner in that relationship, being Russia, under the leadership of Vladimirovich Putin, to move against NATO here, to keep us busy. For all these reasons, we have to make sure that we work as strongly together with them. And then on the hybrid threats, this is, of course, a big worry, and we are working on it.
You know, first of all, it's somehow amazing to me. It seems in their mind, these Europeans, they feel that in a relationship, some people should be, you know, a party should be the master, the other should be junior. You know, that's not the case in the relationship between Russia and China. I mean, within BRICS, you look at the countries, the way that they're behaving, they're trying to, you know, deal with, to communicate with each other. You see, they put their differences aside. They're trying to do the best to make some sort of relationship. But that doesn't work in the mind of Europeans. They have to have the master as the, you know, the United States is the master and the vassals of the United States. But after all, what, to the point that he's making toward China, what is that?
Let me try to answer this way, because he's been running this line for several months. He spelled it out in an interview with the New York Times in July of this year. And I've got the text in front of me so that we can look at it carefully. But let me make a couple of preliminary points about Mark Rutte. Mark Rutte has been the Prime Minister of the Netherlands during the build-up of hatred for Russia that began the drive of the Netherlands to war with Russia. He's a liar. He's a liar of enormous proportion, but a successful one, politically speaking. He's held together coalition to keep himself prime minister for a very long time, based on initially the MH17 lie. I wrote a book about the way that lie was done. That is the shooting down of the Malaysian Airlines flight over eastern Ukraine, for which Russia was blamed, and about which the Dutch put on trial, essentially Russia, but 4 individuals, and found 3 of them guilty. Rutte was part of and the driving force of the lie machine that made the MH17 a weapon, as Novichok became a weapon in the UK, and Novichok became a weapon with Alexei Navalny in Germany later. These are massive attempts to persuade public opinion in those countries to accept war footing with Russia. Information war to begin with, propaganda to begin with, then economic sanctions with the penalties the Dutch have paid for the loss of their massive losses of their trade with Russia, and ultimately now the reorientation of NATO. That's the kind of lie that Rutte has been successful at, okay? If you're successful, you go on repeating the lie, and he's achieved a promotion to NATO, and he's making a more public display of being Secretary General of NATO under the arm and guidance of President Trump, which is considerably more effective in PR terms than his predecessors. Now, what is he doing there? Well, he's trying to keep President Trump in NATO. The biggest threat to the system of lying that kept Rutte in power in the Netherlands was that the US would abandon them. And they all remember that Trump became very negative towards NATO for, quotes, not doing its share. So each time Rutte speaks of taking the war against Russia to China and getting China to come under NATO's guns and so forth, he's trying to feed what he believes to be the US policy, where China is the principal weapon. Let me read you from the New York Times version of what he would say, where he's trying to keep Trump in NATO by aligning NATO with Trump's China objective. If you want to defend the US, I'm quoting Rutte, you have to make sure that 3 things are secure. You need a secure Arctic, because it's opening up and the Chinese and Russians are sailing there. You need a secure Atlantic because it's your sea. It's crucial. He's talking by your, he means the Americans. And you need a secure Europe because Russia's here and Russia is reconstituting itself at an incredible pace, not to attack Norway, but to attack ultimately the US. If the Arctic, the Atlantic Ocean, and Europe are not secure, the US has a big problem. So you see what he's doing? He's trying to say, we are on the front lines of protecting you, Mr. President, Mr. Trump. Second, then he says about China. This is where he tries to make the pitch that NATO can serve Trump's objectives in combating its principal enemy, China. And the way he says it, if you don't mind me quoting, I'll say, President Trump put in place an excellent foreign policy team, including Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, and Matt Whitaker, the ambassador here at NATO. And there's broad agreement that when it comes to the defense of NATO territory, the US is part and parcel. That means it's not only about defending Europe, it's about the United States. The US is not secure if the Atlantic, Europe, and the Arctic are not secure. That's his first point. Second point, there's a second reason, he says, I'm quoting again, that has to do with the Indo-Pacific, Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean. There's an increasing realization, and let's not be naive about it. If Xi Jinping would attack Taiwan, would first make sure that he makes a call to his very junior partner in all of this, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, residing in Moscow, and telling him, hey, I'm going to do this, and I need you to keep them busy in Europe by attacking NATO territory. That's the most likely way this will progress. And to deter them, we need to do two things. One is NATO being so strong that the Russians will never do this. And second, working with the Indo-Pacific, something President Trump is very much promoting. You see, what he's saying is, we protect you, Mr. Trump, so you keep NATO together, and we agree on a funding and a political and a military relationship. You don't walk away from NATO. Second, you can't walk away from NATO because we're going to help you defend China. That's what he's doing.
It seems to me, John, the mood in Washington is somehow is changing, because it's not just about, recently we've heard Benjamin Netanyahu talking about China. China is the main enemy, and Europe is changing the tone toward China. Do you feel that still having the two conflicts with Russia and in the Middle East, the administration in Washington somehow shifting toward China more aggressively, they're trying to be more aggressive toward China, or there still is part of the game against Russia? The whole thing is the game against Russia.
Well, it's both. My answer to you would be it's both. And we tried to explain this by pointing out that some of the people who've got more brains than Mr. Hegseth at the Pentagon have actually put to paper. Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, that's the brains behind policy and strategy, and his partner, whose name suddenly escapes me, have written papers through a consulting firm they run in Washington that proposes the idea of sequencing of wars. The US should conserve its military capacities to fight only those adversaries at the point at which it can win. It should not waste its resources where it cannot win definitively and overwhelmingly. Sequencing of wars means to them, move on from the Ukraine battlefield. We'll sell the weapons. Europe will provide, pay for them, supply them to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians will do the fighting and the dying. We, the US, will move on to the other principal priority battlefield, which is China. And we've just seen Mr. Rutte say that China wants to invade Taiwan and will use Russia as a feint to preoccupy Europe while it does that. So sequencing of war is what the US strategy of war fighting is. In that sequence, Russia is just as much a target and an enemy and an adversary as China. But the priority for the Americans is China with maximum resource. And you can see the Trump administration, Bessent, the Treasury Secretary whom you've just mentioned, is escalating all the time the trade war weapons against China, leaving the Europeans to fight the war on the battlefield for the US, on the battlefield of the Ukraine, while the US concentrates elsewhere. As my understanding, that's what they're doing.
Yesterday, John, there was Lavrov was answering the question from the Arab media, and they were asking about many issues. One of them was the peace deal, Trump's peace deal in Egypt. And Lavrov was asked why was Russia not invited to the to the summit they had. Your take on that? He said that he put the blame somehow, in my opinion, he was trying to put the blame on Egypt, but we know that Egypt was i- they're nothing in my opinion. It's all said by the United States. Donald Trump has decided who's going to participate, who's going to be there. And your take on the whole situation. What is happening in the mind of Russians in terms of the case of the Middle East?
Well, I'm sure you mean to divide the Middle East between Iran on the one hand and the Arab world on the other.
Yeah.
And this is about the Gaza genocide and Israeli threats to the rest of the Arab world, in particular Syria, Lebanon, and so on. Iran's a slightly different case. Iran was also not invited, as I understand, although there was a controversy of whether, if Iran was invited, Mr. Pezeshkian would go. There were 20.
My understanding is that Iran was invited, but they rejected because
I see.
the foreign minister of Iran said that they're not going to be there. And then Pezeshkian, the president, nor the foreign minister of Iran, they said that they're not going to be there. There is no point to talk with the United States after being attacked and sanctioned by and threatened by the United States. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for correcting me. Yes, that's quite right. Why wasn't Russia invited? And how is Russia dealing with Israel and the Palestinian issue? How did Foreign Minister Lavrov handle this when he had the lengthy question and answer session with Arab journalists yesterday? Several days before, he had a small interview with RT, the Russian state outlet, in which he summarized what Russia's purpose was in calling an Arab summit, the first ever Arab summit in Moscow, which would have included all of the Arab leaders, plus, of course, the Arab League chairman, who's Egyptian at the moment. That had to be called off. The Prime Minister of Iraq, Mr. al-Sudani, telephoned Mr. Putin and said that there could be no Arab summit at this stage. That's a significant blow to Russian prestige, to the Russian organization of the summit, which had been underway for weeks and months, in an attempt to show that there was a platform in Moscow that would accommodate all the variety of Arab views, including all the Palestinian groups, including Hamas, including the Palestine Authority of Mahmoud Abbas, and the other factions. By the way, they weren't invited to the peace summit either. There was Mr. Abbas, but no other Palestinian. The combatants who signed the peace agreement were not invited to the peace summit. Their exclusion is something Foreign Minister Lavrov failed to mention during the discussion with the Arab journalists. What has happened in Russian policy is very significant over the last few weeks. We've talked a lot about it since the collapse of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria and the withdrawal of both Russia and Iran from Syria and its occupation and partition by Turkey, Israel, and the United States. What happened in the last week or two in Russian politics is complicated and not really discussed openly. In the first place, there's the perception, I'm not making news here, that President Putin has a special relationship with the Israelis. He demonstrated that by making a telephone call to Prime Minister Netanyahu last Monday, and he did not call any of the Arab leaders. He then followed that with a telephone call to President Erdogan of Turkey. The perception that President Putin is unusually sympathetic to and supportive of Israel undermines the, let's call it, the willingness of the Russian side, as Foreign Minister Lavrov said, to be a fair balancer of interests. That's a principle, balancing of interests, that Lavrov repeated in his lengthy Q&A and press conference with the Arab journalists. What he said and what he didn't say, we'll try to answer quickly because that tells you quite a lot about the unresolved differences within Russian policy and the perception in the Arab world that either the Arab world doesn't understand what the Russian policy is or doesn't trust the Russian policy. On the one hand, unlike any of the Trump plans, which have been endorsed by Lavrov in that session and by President Putin earlier, there's the clear commitment to a Palestinian state, to the state of Palestine. The Russian side is consistent with that. The American so-called peace plan and the peace summit and the declaration signed by just two Arabs, the Qatari Emir and the president of Egypt, General Sisi, and one Turk, President Erdogan. Only 3 out of 27 signed, and it doesn't commit to a Palestine state. Neither does Trump's 20-point plan for Gaza. No commitment to a Palestine state, no commitment to Palestinian governance in the Gazan territory. And as Lavrov said, it's another positive of Russian policy. There's no mention of the West Bank in the so-called peace summit in Sharm el-Sheikh. And as Lavrov pointed out, the Palestine state must include all those territories, not only Gaza, but the West Bank. Also, Lavrov mentioned Hamas as one of the Palestinian interlocutors for the eventual settlement of peace between the Arabs and Israel in the territory of Palestine. Hamas, said Lavrov, quotes, remains part of Palestinian society. That contrasts directly, explicitly with Trump's 20-point peace plan, which says that Hamas doesn't exist and will no longer exist in the Gaza territory. So I'm saying, why am I saying this? Because there are very significant differences between the Russian policy that would have evolved at an Arab summit in Moscow, that Lavrov spelled out, but Lavrov doesn't point out that these are fundamentally contradictory to the objectives of the Americans and the Israelis in the so-called 20-point Trump plan and the so-called peace summit declaration of the Turks, the Qataris, and the Egyptians. What is the Russian policy on such things as President Trump's Board of Peace, the international overseers, the BOP, Board of Peace, that would eliminate Palestinian governance by imposing a viceroy? Tony Blair was recommended. Trump's going off Tony Blair. That's an important point. The Arabs have told him. That's the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Saudis. We won't tolerate Blair. So Trump has said on his airplane on the way to Israel, Jerusalem, and then Sharm el-Sheikh, that he's got to ask the others what they think of Tony Blair. But let me see if I can read you what Lavrov said. You would think the Russian side would say that an international body cannot dictate the sovereignty of Palestine. He says here, I can't find it. What he does say, and it's important, is it's very important not to upset the delicate language of Trump's 20-point peace plan. Excuse me, why was he supporting the delicate language of a plan which contradicts Russian policy? And why was he quiet on that? That's something that he explains, Lavrov explains, by saying it's necessary to look for, and I'm quoting him, for a balance of interests. The great powers, of course, are called upon to use their influence on all parties to the conflict precisely in order to encourage them to search for a balance of interests. Now, wait a minute. Who in Russian policymaking genuinely thinks that the great powers, that's the United States, the UK, France, and Germany, are looking for a balance of interests? Oh, no. They're looking to crush Palestine and crush Iran to serve their interests. There's no balance there. So why didn't the Russian side say so? Would they have avoided saying it if there'd been an Arab summit in Moscow? Well, the Arabs pulled out because there was no point to go to Moscow to demonstrate what would have appeared to have been opposition to the Trump-Israeli plan. And that's a smack in the face, I suppose you could say, for Moscow. But Lavrov has tried to keep face, preserve face, by saying we are available to balance the interests. Well, you can't be available to balance interests if you're not trusted by all sides. And as you pointed out, Nima, by not inviting the Russians, Trump, the Israelis, the Egyptians, and even the Turks did not make Russia's presence a requirement. It's alleged that President Erdogan said, I will not allow the Prime Minister of Israel to come to this summit. Israel must not appear at this summit. Erdogan apparently said that. Why didn't he say the Russians should? Because he didn't want them any more than others did. So the Russians are rather disadvantaged, to say it politely, by what has happened in this last week. They believe their positions contradict Trump's, but they won't say so in public.
You know, the summit somehow reminds me of the summit. You remember the summit, the peace summit in Switzerland? You know, they all gathered in Switzerland for Ukraine, and Europeans together with Zelensky talking about something that wasn't in the hand of the people who were talking about the case of Ukraine. The same thing is happening has happened in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh. And John, why does Donald Trump, why has he needed to have this summit? What was the main reason? Because it's not about anything substantial with the case of Palestine. It was something else. What was that?
Well, even a ventriloquist doll has to appear on stage. And the stage was this time one that he dominated. He managed to bring 27 states, 27 guests, one of whom is the chairman of the FIFA, the International Football Association, whose name is mentioned at the same protocol level as the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Gutierrez. This was a tribute to Trump. And second, Trump used the tribute in Israel to protect and advance Netanyahu. He asked, quotes, for a pardon for Netanyahu. You can't pardon anybody who's not been convicted, and Netanyahu hasn't been convicted. But there you saw Trump, Kushner, and Witkoff telling the Israelis, Netanyahu is a great war prime minister, a great war fighter, a great defender of Israel. I endorse him. We endorse him. We need him. Don't prosecute him. That was one thing. Second, you saw, and a lot of the podcasters and bloggers have picked up the microphone pickup of private things that Trump was saying. Each one of those individuals has a business deal they want to use with Trump's relatives, his sons and others, in order to advance their own agenda with Trump. So it was a grandstand for Trump to solidify himself at home. I'll come back to the polls in a minute. It was a way of making money, which is what the hand inside the doll always does, reaching for the pocket. And you heard the Indonesian president asking for contacts with Eric Trump, business deals. So it serves all of their natural purposes. It served Netanyahu's particular political purpose. It makes the anti-Palestinians, and I'll call them that, the Egyptians, for example, potentially the occupiers of Gaza, who will, if Trump agrees and the summit, let's say, seems to endorse an international force. Remember, they've abolished the whole principle of Palestinian governance. No transition of Palestinian technocrats. No, there's going to be an army of occupation supervised by the Israelis and the Americans. Who's going to be in it? If the Turks are in it, they will have begun to occupy another part of the old Ottoman Empire. They will be in Gaza as they're currently in Syria. If the Egyptians are in it, they will have recaptured Gaza for Egypt. In other words, the Gaza arrangements will become part of the old history of Egypt and Turkey. Well, that's why they're there. For Trump, I've got to reach for my opinion polls. At the moment, the latest opinion polls in the US show no improvement in Trump's unpopularity. No improvement whatever, flat. So the great peacemaking effort that he wanted to show on screen for several days has so far failed to rally American voter support. But that's what it was for. In in the calculation of those behind him at the White House, Stephen Miller and others, whose job it is to get themselves in power and stay in power. So it was a platform to raise their popularity. And for the time being, American voters aren't fooled. That's intelligent.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you very much for having me, Nima.